I knew something was off the minute I saw the muddy footprints tracking across my back porch. I live on the edge of a quiet neighborhood in northern Missouri. The kind of place where neighbors wave, but mostly keep to themselves. Or at least they used to, before the HOA got drunk on power and decided they were the rulers of all things within a 5M radius. And the queen of that little tyrant kingdom? Margaret Tilson. Blonde bob, pastel cardigans, and a voice like a chainsaw dragging across tile. I'm Davis Langley. I'm a carpenter by trade, a single dad, and a man who doesn't take kindly to trespassers, especially when that trespasser is the president of our HOA and believes her clipboard gives her the right to violate private property. For the past 3 months, Margaret's been waging a passive-aggressive war on me. First, it was my truck being too visible from the street. Then, it was the unauthorized vegetable patch in my backyard. And last week, she threatened to fine me for excessive use of natural wood tones on my porch. I kid you not. She said it clashed with the neighborhood's aesthetic. I'd started locking the gate on my backyard fence after I caught her peeking over it with binoculars, but this was something else. I followed the muddy prints down the steps, across the patch of gravel behind the shed, and straight to the wooden door of my root cellar. The old thing was built into a hill, reinforced with concrete and steel. I store produce down there, tools, some emergency supplies. Nothing fancy, but it's mine. The door was cracked open. I pulled it wide and stepped inside, careful not to make a sound. The air was cool, earthy. And then I heard it, shuffling, whispering, someone breathing. I flipped the switch, and the overhead bulb buzzed to life. There she was, Margaret freaking Tilson, crouched near my potato bins with her phone out, snapping pictures like she was on an undercover mission. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I said. She jumped like she'd seen a ghost, turned toward me with this smug, self-satisfied look. "Mr. Langley," she said, brushing dust off her floral blouse, "you've got unregistered storage down here. This isn't permitted in a residential zone. You broke into my property. I have every right to inspect HOA violations," she said, holding up her phone like it was a badge. "According to Section 14, subsection B." "No, you don't," I cut in. "This cellar isn't under HOA jurisdiction. It's been here since the house was built in 1947. And you just committed trespassing." She crossed her arms like she was daring me to do something. "I'll be reporting this to the board." "Good," I said, stepping back outside. "You can tell them when the sheriff gets here." I locked the cellar door shut with the outer bolt. "Excuse me," she shouted from inside. "I'm preserving the scene of a break-in," I called back. "You stay right there." And I meant it. I walked straight back to the house and called the sheriff's department. I'd had enough. This wasn't a neighborly dispute anymore. It was stalking, harassment, illegal entry, and I had her dead to rights. By the time Deputy Harlan showed up 30 minutes later, Margaret was shouting about unlawful imprisonment and civil lawsuits. I didn't even flinch. I just handed Harlan the footage from my security camera. The one she didn't know was mounted under the eaves of my garage, directly facing the cellar. "Clear as day," I said. Came in through the side gate, ignored the signs, went straight for the cellar. Harlan watched the footage, jaw tightening. He knocked on the cellar door. "Ma'am, come on out. I demand you arrest this man," she shouted. He unlocked the door. She came out, flustered, red-faced, still spewing threats. But Harlan wasn't having it. "You're the HOA president, right?" he asked. "That's correct. And I was performing a routine. You entered a locked structure on private property without permission. That's criminal trespass." She blanched. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," Harlan said, pulling out his notepad. "You're lucky he didn't press charges for stalking. I want to speak to your supervisor." "Margaret," I interrupted. "You're not in charge here." She looked like she wanted to explode. Instead, she huffed, spun around, and stomped toward the street. But Harlan wasn't done. He walked after her, asked her to stay put, and in 10 minutes, she was sitting in the back of his cruiser while he radioed in the charge. That should have been the end of it. But this is the HOA we're talking about. 2 days later, I got a letter on official HOA letterhead, signed by the vice president, a weasel-faced guy named Paul Dinsmore. It claimed I had violated community standards by creating unsafe structures and endangering a community leader. They were trying to fine me $10,000. $10,000 for locking a trespasser in the very space she broke into. I laughed at first. Then I realized they were serious. They were trying to bankrupt me. Retaliation, pure and simple. So I did what any man with a little grit and a lot of receipts would do. I grabbed my binder. The one where I'd been documenting every insane letter, every photo of Margaret skulking around, every timestamp from my cameras, and I called an old friend from high school. Her name's Helena Brooke. She's a city attorney now, and she hates corrupt HOAs more than I do. "You've got enough here to burn them to the ground," she said after flipping through my notes. "Good," I replied, "because I'm done playing defense." The war had officially started, and I wasn't going to lose. By the following Wednesday, the neighborhood had turned into a pressure cooker. I noticed it first in the way people paused when walking their dogs, glancing at my house, hesitating, then moving on with a little more urgency than usual. A couple of them avoided eye contact altogether. Margaret's little disciples had clearly gotten the memo. I expected whispers and sideways glances, but what I didn't expect was the anonymous envelope in my mailbox. No return address, just my name scrolled across the front in shaky handwriting. I opened it on the spot, standing at the curb. Inside was a single folded sheet of cheap printer paper, typed in bold. "Watch yourself. You may have won one round, but you don't know who you're dealing with." No signature, no contact, just the kind of threat that makes your stomach twist. I walked straight back into the house, locked the door, and called Helena. She picked up on the first ring. "You're not going to believe what just landed in my mailbox," I said. "Let me guess. Anonymous threat? Bingo. That's textbook retaliation. Don't toss it. Gloves on. Bag it, and get it to the sheriff. And Davis," she paused, her tone sharpening. "This isn't about a fine anymore. They're testing how far they can go, which means you need to be 3 steps ahead." Now, my security system was already solid, but I spent the rest of that evening adding motion-triggered lights and a second camera focused on the front yard. If they were going to try something, I wanted it caught from every angle. The next morning, I made an appointment with Sheriff McBride. He was an older guy, calm as a stone wall but sharp as a tack. I handed him the envelope in an evidence bag and showed him the footage I'd saved of Margaret's break-in. He leaned back in his chair. "Langley, I've been watching that HOA for years. Never had enough to act. But this," he tapped the bag, "this crosses a new line. Any chance you can get a warrant? See what else they are hiding." He raised an eyebrow. "Depends what turns up. But keep your eyes open. These folks play dirty." I left the station with a growing fire in my chest. If Margaret and the board were willing to escalate to threats, that meant I was getting too close to something they didn't want found. And I intended to find every last bit of it. That night, Helena sent over the first draft of a formal complaint we were filing with the county. It outlined a pattern of harassment, misuse of HOA funds, and abuse of power. But it wasn't just about stopping the fines anymore. It was about cracking the whole rotten system open. "Paul's name shows up a lot in the financials," she said during our call. I pulled the HOA's quarterly reports from the public filings. The numbers don't add up. There's a landscaping company that billed them for more than double the standard rate, every single month, for over a year. You think it's a shell? I know it is. Registered under a fake LLC in Iowa. Guess who the agent is? Don't say it. Paul Dinsmore. That explained the sudden spike in HOA fees last summer and the emergency assessments they kept pushing through without votes. They were siphoning money straight into their own pockets. I printed everything out. Every invoice, every transaction, every inconsistency. The more pages I laid out on my dining table, the clearer the picture became. Margaret was the face, the rule enforcer, the distraction. Paul was the one bleeding the community dry behind the scenes. I needed one more piece of evidence before going public. Proof they were using HOA funds for personal gain. So I paid a visit to the county records office, tucked away in a back corner of a beige municipal building. The clerk behind the desk barely looked up when I asked for access to the HOA's property transactions. "Need anything special?" he asked, flipping open his logbook. "Just your most recent filings. Last 6 months." He handed me a folder with a yawn. "Knock yourself out." Most of it was routine. Liens, assessments, zoning requests. But one entry caught my eye. A parcel of land just outside the neighborhood's jurisdiction, 4 acres of wooded buffer zone that had never been developed. It had been purchased under the HOA's name, but the contact listed for the transaction? Margaret Tilson. And the mailing address for the tax documents? Paul Dinsmore's law office. They were using HOA funds to buy land they personally controlled. That was enough to get state auditors involved. I took copies of everything and drove straight to Helena's office. She reviewed it in silence, her brow furrowing deeper with every page. "This is it," she said. "We take this to the state's attorney and the press. But Davis, once this goes public, they're not going to throw petty threats anymore." "I'm not worried about petty," I said. "I'm worried about what they'll do when they realize they've lost." The next day, I held a neighborhood meeting. I rented out the community center on my own dime, sent out flyers. No HOA branding, just a simple message. Know your rights. See what your fees are funding. I expected maybe a dozen people to show. Over 50 came. Some were skeptical. Others were furious. But when I started laying out the documents, projector on the wall, line by line, there was no denying what they saw. Margaret's personal shopping charges billed as community improvement. Paul's fake landscaping firm, the illegal land purchase. A soft-spoken retiree named Mrs. Howard stood up midway through and said, "They raised my dues last month because they said the playground needed repairs. There haven't been kids on that thing in years." Someone else muttered. Murmurs turned into outrage. I handed out copies of the complaint Helena had prepared. By the end of the night, 37 homeowners signed on as co-complainants. The next morning, the sheriff's office received a formal request for a fraud investigation. The same packet went to the Missouri State Auditor's office, and Helena submitted a grievance to the state bar against Paul. Margaret must have sensed the walls closing in because 2 days later, she made her last move. I came home from work to find my driveway blocked, a tow truck idling at the curb, Margaret standing beside it, clipboard in hand, issuing instructions like a general. "That's private property," I said, stepping out of my truck. "Your vehicle has been cited for repeated violations," she said without turning. "We are enforcing a temporary seizure pending legal review. You don't have that authority." She handed a folded notice to the tow driver and waved him forward. I didn't argue. I walked into the garage, pulled out my phone, and called the sheriff. 15 minutes later, 2 deputies rolled up, lights flashing. The tow driver stopped immediately. Margaret's eyes widened as Deputy Harlan stepped out, same one who'd pulled her from my cellar. "Ma'am," he said, already annoyed, "you're interfering with private property." "I have board authorization," she said, holding up a different clipboard this time. "We've already informed you that you're under investigation," he replied. "And until that concludes, you are suspended from any enforcement actions. That includes towing." He turned toward the driver. "Unhook the vehicle. Now." Margaret wouldn't stop talking. She kept insisting I was destabilizing the community, that I had manipulated the residents, that I was running a smear campaign. Harlan had heard enough. "Ma'am, you need to come with us." "What? On what charge?" "Violation of a court-ordered cease and desist, and obstruction of an ongoing investigation." She was still ranting as they walked her to the cruiser. This time, there were neighbors watching from porches. No one defended her. No one said a word. And for the first time in months, I felt the pressure ease. Not because it was over, but because now the whole neighborhood could see what I'd seen all along. And they were ready to fight back. The morning after Margaret was driven off in the back of a cruiser, the silence in the neighborhood was almost suspicious. No car horns, no barking dogs, not even the usual early joggers. It was like the whole block had paused, holding its breath. I poured myself a mug of coffee and stepped out onto my porch. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that hinted at an early frost. Across the street, Mr. Kavanaugh stood beside his mailbox, watching me. Not glaring, just watching. I raised my hand in a casual greeting. He gave a slow nod, then turned back inside. The truth was, half the residents were still trying to figure out if I was a hero or a troublemaker. The other half already knew the answer. But it didn't matter anymore. Margaret's arrest had cracked something open, and now people were seeing the rot beneath the surface. By noon, Helena called with an update. The state auditor's office had launched a formal inquiry. They were sending investigators to comb through the HOA's finances. The same day, Paul Dinsmore's law license was placed under review. Helena had submitted a supplemental complaint linking his firm to several questionable real estate transactions in surrounding counties. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," she said. "And it's not just your HOA. There are 3 others nearby showing the same signs. Same fake vendors, same sudden fee hikes. This might be bigger than we thought." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process it all. "If it's a racket," I said, "they didn't just fleece us. They built a whole system around it." "Exactly," she replied. "And the state's finally paying attention." That night, I found an envelope taped to my front door. No threats this time, just a single sheet of paper with one sentence typed dead center. "You don't know what she saw." I stared at it for a long time. Then I opened my phone and scrolled back through the footage from the day I caught Margaret in my cellar. Something had bugged me about it, but I hadn't paid close attention before. She hadn't just been taking pictures of my supplies. She'd opened a hidden cabinet in the back wall. One I'd built to store emergency fuel cans and a backup generator battery. She'd taken photos inside it. There was nothing illegal in there, just gear I'd prepped for storm outages. But she'd gone straight to that cabinet like she knew what she was looking for. The next morning, I visited the county clerk's office again. I asked the same clerk, as before, for all zoning requests and land surveys filed by the HOA in the past year. He pulled a manila folder from a drawer and slid it across the counter. "Anything else?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Show me any soil testing permits filed under their name." He squinted. "That's oddly specific." "I know." He returned 10 minutes later with a single page. Permit request. A request to conduct subsoil testing for future waterline development on the HOA's behalf. But the coordinates they listed? They weren't within the neighborhood. They were behind my property, right where the hill started to slope, just past my root cellar. I drove straight home and hiked behind the shed to the overgrown ridge. It was barely 10 feet wide, flanked by brush and wild sumac. Halfway up the slope, I found freshly disturbed soil, flat, circular patches where the grass had been cut away, and a small orange surveyor's flag still stuck in the ground. They'd been digging back here. That night, I installed a third motion camera facing the ridge, just in case someone decided to come back. By the end of the week, everything accelerated. The state audit team showed up in 2 unmarked vehicles, escorted by 2 deputies from the sheriff's office. They began with the HOA's office suite, a modest space above a strip mall downtown. But within an hour, they'd called in backup. Turns out Margaret and Paul hadn't just been cooking the books. They'd been laundering HOA dues to purchase parcels of land near proposed infrastructure developments. Land they knew would increase in value once the county expanded utilities. And they'd used insider information to time those purchases. That was insider trading on a municipal level, sure, but still illegal. The sheriff called me personally to give me the update. They were trying to buy up the water rights beneath your property, he said. That's what the soil testing was for. There's a natural spring that runs under the ridge. If they could prove it passed into the common area, they could claim it for development. So they were trying to annex my land, I muttered. Not just yours. At least 4 properties on the edge of the neighborhood. You were just the first one to fight back. I hung up and called Helena. She didn't sound surprised. They were hoping no one would notice until it was too late, she said. And Margaret? She wasn't digging for HOA violations. She was looking for anything they could use to declare your lot non-compliant, so they could seize it under community enforcement. Is that even legal? Not without a court order. And not without a vote from the residents, which, of course, they never held. By the following Monday, the local news picked up the story. I watched the segment in my living room, surrounded by file folders and half-drunk cups of coffee. The anchor read from a teleprompter, while footage rolled of Margaret being led out of the HOA office in handcuffs, a jacket draped over her head. Allegations of embezzlement, fraud, and illegal land acquisition have rocked the West Briar Estates neighborhood, where residents are demanding a full audit and the immediate dissolution of their homeowners association. The camera cut to a reporter interviewing a neighbor I hadn't spoken to in years, Mrs. Domings, who lived 3 doors down. I just want to know where our money went, she said, trembling. I trusted them. We all did. My phone buzzed with messages. People thanking me, others apologizing for not stepping in sooner. A few offered to help however they could, but I didn't respond to most of them because later that night, as I was double-checking my camera feeds, I saw something that made the hairs rise on the back of my neck. At 2:30 in the morning, the motion alert pinged. The Ridge camera lit up. A figure in a dark coat, trudging through the underbrush. Not Margaret. Not Paul. This man moved with purpose. He stopped near the flagged soil, knelt down, and began scraping at the dirt with a small trowel. He wasn't searching. He was retrieving. I watched as he pulled out a black case, slim, rectangular, the kind used to store documents or electronics. He tucked it into his coat and disappeared back into the trees. I took the footage straight to the sheriff the next morning. He watched it twice, then turned to me with a grave expression. We're going to need to search that entire slope, he said. If they buried materials up there, it could be evidence. Evidence of what? I don't know yet, but I've seen that kind of case before. It's used in real estate fraud to hide original deeds and forge surveys. The investigation shifted into overdrive. Over the next 3 days, deputies and forensic surveyors combed the ridge using ground-penetrating radar. They uncovered 2 more cases, one filled with duplicate property records, the other with USB drives containing scanned documents. One of those drives held a file marked WB expansion plan. Inside were blueprints for a luxury condo complex planned to replace the outer ring of homes in the neighborhood, including mine. They planned to dissolve the HOA, then sell the land back to themselves through shell companies, evict the residents, level the homes, and cash in. It was organized land theft on paper in detail. That was the final nail. The county prosecutor filed charges against both Margaret and Paul. Conspiracy to commit fraud, unlawful land seizure attempts, falsification of legal documents, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. A judge ordered the HOA's operations suspended indefinitely. A third-party trustee was appointed to manage essential maintenance until the association could be formally dissolved. I stood on my back porch the evening the news broke, listening to the wind shift through the trees. The ridge was quiet finally. No footsteps, no digging, no survey flags, just peace. The neighborhood would take time to heal. Some folks still didn't know what to say to me. Others brought over casseroles or asked if I'd consider running for whatever board came next. I told them the truth. No more boards, just neighbors. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like enough. By the time the final court date arrived, Westbury Estates barely resembled the place I'd moved into 8 years ago. The manicured illusion had crumbled. Gone were the smug newsletters, the pastel flags, the endless citations over fence height and mailbox paint. What remained was a neighborhood waking up from a long, collective sleep. And not all of it was pretty. We'd learned who had been quietly benefiting and who had been silently enduring. Now it was time to face what came next. I stood outside the county courthouse in Jefferson with Helena and 2 other residents who had joined the civil suit as co-plaintiffs. One was a retired postal worker named Janelle. The other, a local electrician named Curtis, who had nearly lost his home after being hit with manufactured violation fees. They'd been brave enough to speak out when it counted, and now their testimonies were about to be read into public record. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with a tension that was part anticipation, part disbelief. Paul Dinsmore sat at the defendant's table in a stiff navy suit, his once arrogant posture reduced to a slouch of resignation. Margaret was notably absent, having accepted a plea deal weeks earlier in exchange for a full confession and testimony. Her sentencing was scheduled for later that month. The judge, a sharp-eyed woman in her early 60s named Judge LeClaire, entered briskly and called the case to order. The state prosecutor, a no-nonsense man named Daniel Kessler, wasted no time laying out the charges. In addition to the prior financial crimes, investigators had uncovered a disturbing string of coercion tactics used to force property owners to sell at below market value. Tactics that included forged code violations, fraudulent safety inspections, and even threats of property seizure based on fabricated zoning changes. The defendants did not just mismanage funds, Kessler said. They engineered a system of control that weaponized bureaucracy. They turned a neighborhood association into a predatory enterprise. And they did it while hiding behind the language of community standards. When Helena took her turn, her voice was steady. The most dangerous thing about this scheme wasn't its complexity, she said. It was how ordinary it looked. Letters, fines, surveys, all dressed up in legitimacy. But underneath, it was extortion. And it would have succeeded if not for one man who had the nerve to say no. She nodded toward me. I didn't move. I wasn't here for praise. The judge called for witness statements. Janelle spoke first. Her voice cracked as she described how her fixed income had been drained by mounting, baseless fees. They said my porch railings were a hazard, she said. I had them inspected twice, but every time I disputed it, they tacked on a late fee, then another. I paid over $6,000 just trying to keep them off my back. Curtis followed. He relayed how he'd had to cancel a work contract after being forced to attend mandatory HOA hearings that always, coincidentally, fell during business hours. I missed a major job installing emergency backup systems in a medical building. They knew it. That hearing was about a lawn sign. A single sign. Then it was my turn. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need them. I built my house with my own hands, I said. Every beam, every joint. My daughter helped stain the fence when she was 12. I've worked every day to make sure we have a home worth keeping. And these people tried to take that away. Not for safety, not for community, for profit. I paused, letting the silence settle. They came after me because I didn't roll over, because I had a cellar they thought they could use, a property they wanted to claim. But they didn't count on me keeping records or cameras, or calling someone who knew what to do with it all. Judge Leclerc instructed the clerk to read Margaret's signed deposition aloud. The room held its breath as her thin, cursive signature scrolled across a document that detailed how Paul had orchestrated the fake vendor scheme. Margaret had acted as the enforcer, using her position to fabricate violations and intimidate homeowners. In return, she received monthly payouts disguised as community improvement stipends, totaling over $80,000 in 2 years. But the real bombshell came at the end. In a recorded confession, Margaret admitted that Paul had pressured her into accessing private properties, including mine, under the pretense of pre-development surveys. She confessed to having taken photos in my root cellar, not to report violations, but to look for structural weaknesses they could exploit to claim the space as a public hazard. That's why she went straight to the cabinet. I muttered under my breath. Helena leaned over. She was looking for anything they could spin into a code violation. If that cabinet had been unsecured, they could have argued it was a fire risk and filed an emergency injunction, which would have let them take temporary control of the property. Helena nodded once. Exactly. By the week's end, the jury returned a verdict. Paul Dinsmore was found guilty on all counts: wire fraud, conspiracy, tampering with public records, attempted unlawful seizure of private property. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in a state penitentiary, with no chance of parole for at least 10. Margaret, under her deal, received 3 years of supervised probation, community service, and a lifetime ban from holding any administrative position in any residential organization. But the legal victory was only part of the story. The court also ordered the immediate dissolution of the West Briar Estates HOA. All funds in its accounts were frozen pending restitution payments to affected homeowners. A third-party mediator was appointed to ensure every resident who had been wrongly fined or charged was paid back in full, with interest. At the next community gathering, no longer an HOA meeting, just a neighborhood potluck, people came in flannel shirts and worn jeans instead of pressed slacks and stiff smiles. Curtis brought brisket. Janelle made peach cobbler. I grilled burgers. No one talked about bylaws or compliance forms, just whether family, and what local contractor could actually be trusted to fix a sagging roof without quoting double. Helena showed up wearing a Cardinals cap and holding a 6-pack of root beer. "You ever think about running for city council?" she asked as she handed me a bottle. "I'd rather sand drywall with my teeth," I said. "Fair enough. But if you ever want to teach a class on how to dismantle a corrupt HOA, let me know. There's demand." I looked around at the people, some still wary, others finally relaxed, and felt something settle in my chest for the first time in months. Not triumph, relief. The ridge behind my house was quiet again. No more survey flags, no more digging. I'd planted wild asters along the path where the soil had been disturbed. By spring, they'd bloom. A few weeks later, I took down the last of my motion cameras. I left the one above the garage, just in case, but the rest went back in their boxes. I didn't need to watch my back anymore, not like before. And the cellar? I reinforced the door, not to keep anyone in, but to remind myself that I had the right to protect what was mine. That cellar had become more than just root storage. It was where the whole ordeal had started, where I'd drawn my line in the dirt and said, "No more." And this time, the world had listened.